I knew she had stolen my promotion the moment my boss couldn't look me in the eye. For 5 years, I had built my career at Hawthorne Analytics, one spreadsheet, one late night, one sacrificed weekend at a time. And when I say late nights, I mean the kind where you leave the office at 9:47 p.m., the cleaning crew already vacuuming around your chair, and you tell yourself it's temporary because the promotion is coming. I was a senior project coordinator earning just under $92,000 a year, living in a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes outside downtown Chicago, budgeting carefully, turning down vacations, telling my parents back in Ohio that the grind would pay off. Everyone knew a management spot was opening at the end of Q2. My director, Mark Reynolds, had hinted at it during my annual review in March. He said, "Keep doing what you're doing, Jason. You're next in line." I replayed that sentence in my head for months like it was a signed contract. I led the Harrison account, a $3.4 million portfolio that had been struggling before I took it over. I reorganized the reporting system, rebuilt the client relationship, and personally drove to Milwaukee twice in 1 week to smooth things over when numbers dipped. I trained 2 new hires, including Lauren Whitmore, who joined our team last summer with a polished smile and a resume that looked impressive but light on real-world results. I remember sitting across from her in the small conference room with the glass walls, walking her through our internal dashboards, explaining which metrics actually mattered and which ones were just noise. She took notes in a leather-bound notebook and thanked me for being patient. I didn't think twice about it. That's what team players do. By early June, I was working around 60 hours a week, tracking deliverables in color-coded sheets, drafting strategy decks, and sending status updates before anyone had to ask. When Mark scheduled an all-hands meeting for Monday at 10 a.m. with the subject line "Leadership Announcement," I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I even called my older sister the night before and told her to keep her phone nearby because I expected good news. Monday morning, I wore my navy suit, the one I save for client pitches, and got to the office by 7:30 a.m. to review numbers one last time. The conference room filled up fast. The air felt overly conditioned, the way it always does in summer, and I remember noticing Lauren sitting 2 chairs away from Mark instead of her usual spot near the back. She was unusually quiet, hands folded, eyes forward. Mark started with a speech about growth, resilience, and rewarding leadership. My heart was steady, confident. Then he said her name. "We're excited to announce Lauren Whitmore as our new operations manager." There was applause. Someone even let out a small cheer. I didn't clap. I just sat there, the sound around me turning distant, like I was underwater. Mark kept talking about her strategic insight and exceptional ownership of key initiatives, phrases that felt strangely familiar because they were lifted almost word for word from slides I had written for our quarterly review. Lauren stood up, smiling in a controlled, almost surprised way, thanking the team, thanking Mark, saying she was honored and excited to lead us into the next chapter. She glanced at me briefly, just for a second, and there was something in that look I couldn't quite define. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't triumph. It was calculation. As the meeting wrapped up, coworkers patted her on the back. A few people gave me sympathetic half-smiles, the kind that say, "I thought it was going to be you." Mark avoided eye contact when he walked past me. He just said, "Let's connect later this week, Jason." That was when the certainty settled in my chest. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This wasn't random. Somewhere between the late nights, the client calls, and the trust one thought I had earned, something had shifted. And I was starting to realize I hadn't just been overlooked. I had been replaced. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk in a kind of quiet disbelief, the kind that does not explode all at once but settles slowly into your bones. My inbox was already filling up with congratulatory emails addressed to Lauren, copied to the entire department. Subject lines like "well-deserved" and "excited for the future" stacked on top of each other while I stared at my own screen, still open to the performance metrics I had finalized at 7:12 that morning. I kept replaying the past 6 months in my head, trying to pinpoint the moment I had miscalculated. I had led every Harrison strategy call. Since January, I had built the forecasting model that increased client retention by 12% year over year. I had drafted the operational roadmap that Lauren had presented during the April review, the same roadmap Mark had praised as forward-thinking and decisive. At the time, I thought it reflected well on both of us. Now I was not so sure. Around 11:30, Lauren walked over to my desk. She stood there with that same composed smile and said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said she respected my work and looked forward to collaborating in this new structure. Her tone was polished, almost rehearsed. I told her congratulations because that is what professionals do. I kept my voice steady and measured. She thanked me and mentioned that she would be setting up one-on-one meetings with the team later that week. When she walked away, I noticed that she had already moved her notebook and laptop to the corner office that had belonged to our former manager. It happened that fast. By early afternoon, Mark finally called me into his office. He closed the door gently and said the decision had been difficult. He said leadership was looking for someone who demonstrated visibility and cross-departmental influence. He said I was invaluable, but needed to work on executive presence. I asked him directly whether my performance had been lacking. He said no, not at all. He said the numbers were strong. He said it was more about perception. That word stayed with me. Perception. I walked out of his office feeling like I had just been evaluated on a category no one had told me existed. Back at my desk, I opened the shared drive and reviewed the Harrison proposal from March, the one that had impressed the client enough to renew for another 12 months. The final presentation deck listed Lauren as primary contributor. I knew for a fact that I had built that file from scratch. I clicked into the version history. The earliest saved draft carried my name. 2 days before the client meeting, the author tag shifted. Minor edits were made. Formatting adjustments. A few sentences rephrased. Then the metadata showed her name as owner. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Not panic, not anger, but clarity. I opened my sent folder and searched for the original draft. There. It was, time-stamped at 10:48 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March, sent to Lauren and copied to Mark for review. The subject line read, Harrison Strategy, Draft Version 1. I compared it side by side with the final version stored in the drive. The structure was identical. The projections were mined down to the decimal. Even the phrasing of the executive summary matched, except for a few cosmetic changes. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the office at the glass walls of the new manager office. Lauren was inside, already on a call, gesturing confidently as if she had always belonged there. That was the moment the doubt faded. This was not about perception. This was about ownership, and somewhere along the line, mine had quietly been reassigned. That night, I stayed in the office long after most of the lights had dimmed, not because I had to, but because I needed to understand how deep this went. The city outside the 12th floor windows was glowing in the early summer heat, traffic crawling along the expressway while I sat at my desk scrolling through months of archived files. I started with the Harrison account because that was the most obvious example, but once I began looking, patterns started to form. I pulled up the Q1 operations summary that Lauren had presented during the April leadership sync. I remembered building the cost efficiency model for that report on a Saturday afternoon in February, drinking stale coffee, and adjusting formulas until the projections balanced within less than half a percentage point. When I opened the document properties, the creation date matched that weekend. The original author field showed my name. 3 days before the presentation, the ownership changed to Lauren. The edits were subtle. A heading reformatted. A bullet point rearranged. A sentence rewritten to sound slightly more assertive. The substance remained mine. I searched my inbox for the email thread tied to that file. There it was, sent at 11:03 p.m., addressed to Lauren with the message, "Let me know if you want to polish the language before we share with Mark." I had handed her the draft in good faith. What I saw next made my pulse steady instead of spike. She had forwarded the same draft to Mark the following morning without copying me. The message read, "Here is the updated operations summary. I prepared. Looking forward to your feedback." There was no mention of collaboration. No reference to my name. Mark had replied within 15 minutes, praising the clarity and initiative. I sat back and stared at the screen, letting the timeline sink in. This was not a single oversight. It was a method. I opened the shared task tracker and filtered by completed projects over the past 6 months. Again and again, I found my fingerprints beneath her signature. Client strategy outlines, budget adjustment proposals, performance dashboards. In each case, I had sent her a draft for review, and in each case, the final version credited her as primary contributor. I thought about the times Mark had complimented her during meetings for being proactive. I remembered nodding along, assuming he was acknowledging team effort. The realization settled over me with uncomfortable clarity. While I was focused on execution, she had been focused on positioning. I did not feel anger in that moment. I felt embarrassed that I had not seen it sooner. Around 8:45 in the evening, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification for a one-on-one Lauren had scheduled with me for Thursday at 2 p.m. The invite description read, "Discuss team structure moving forward." The wording felt clinical, almost corporate in its detachment. I imagined sitting across from her while she outlined new reporting lines, possibly placing me beneath her in projects I had originated. I minimized the calendar window and opened a blank document. Instead of venting, I began organizing what I had found. Dates, file names, email timestamps, version histories. I copied screenshots into a folder on my desktop and labeled it simply Archive. I was careful not to access anything outside my permissions. Everything I reviewed had been shared with me as part of my role. I was not digging into private accounts or restricted drives. I was tracing my own work. As the clock on my screen shifted to 9:12 p.m., I realized something important. If this had influenced the promotion decision, then the narrative presented to leadership had been incomplete at best. I closed my laptop slowly and looked once more at the corner office across the floor, now dark and empty. The applause from that morning echoed faintly in my memory. I did not know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer operating on assumptions. I was operating on evidence. Thursday arrived slower than any week I could remember, and by the time 2 p.m. approached, I had already reviewed the archive folder 3 separate times to make sure every file was properly labeled and backed up to my personal notes. I did not plan to confront her impulsively. I wanted to understand how she would frame the new structure now that she had authority. When I stepped into her office, she was standing by the window overlooking the river, sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings across the water. She turned with that same composed expression and gestured for me to sit. The office still smelled faintly like fresh paint from when our previous manager moved out. She began by thanking me for my continued dedication and said she valued my experience. Then she explained that moving forward, all major client communications would be routed through her for strategic alignment. She said it would streamline decision-making and ensure consistent messaging. I listened carefully, noticing how she emphasized visibility and leadership optics. She mentioned that senior leadership had been impressed with her ability to synthesize complex data into actionable insights. That phrase again. I asked her calmly how she believed that perception had formed. She paused for a fraction of a second before responding that she had taken initiative in presenting solutions and proactively sharing updates with Mark. I asked whether those updates included collaborative work from the team. She said, of course, everything was a team effort, but ultimately someone had to step forward. The way she said it was almost instructional, as if she were teaching a lesson. I left her office without raising my voice or revealing what I knew. Back at my desk, I opened my calendar and noticed something that had not stood out before. Over the past 4 months, Lauren had scheduled at least 9 one-on-one check-ins with Mark that were not labeled as project updates. They were marked simply as sync or touch base. I compared that to my own calendar history. I had focused almost exclusively on client calls and team reviews. I had assumed performance spoke for itself. That assumption now felt naive. I returned to the shared drive and filtered email communications between Lauren and Mark using key project names. Several threads showed her summarizing progress without copying me, even though the attachments originated from drafts I had sent her. In some messages, she used phrases like "as discussed earlier" and "based on my analysis," language that subtly positioned her as the source. I began mapping the timeline on a legal pad beside my keyboard. January model draft sent to Lauren at 10:48 p.m. February cost reduction plan sent at 9:17 p.m. March client retention proposal sent at 11:03 p.m. In each instance, within 24 hours, she had forwarded a refined version upward without including me. It was consistent, deliberate, and strategically timed before key leadership meetings. Around 4:30 p.m., Mark sent out a department-wide email announcing a strategic planning session for the following Tuesday where Lauren would present the roadmap for the next fiscal quarter. As I read the outline attached to the message, my stomach tightened. The framework mirrored the operational blueprint I had drafted 3 weeks earlier for internal discussion. Even the sequencing of milestones was identical, down to the 90-day and 180-day benchmarks. I closed the attachment and stared at the skyline beyond my monitor. This was no longer about a single promotion. It was about authorship of ideas that shaped the department's direction. I understood then that if I remained silent, the narrative would solidify permanently. Perception would harden into record. And once something becomes record in a corporate environment, it rarely gets rewritten. I glanced at the archive folder once more and felt a shift in my thinking. I had spent days gathering proof quietly. The question was no longer whether the pattern existed. The question was when and how to bring it into the light. By Friday morning, the office had already adjusted to the new hierarchy as if it had always existed. Lauren's name was updated on the internal directory with the title Operations Manager, and her calendar showed blocks of meetings stretching from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. I kept my routine steady, arriving at 7:30 a.m., reviewing client dashboards, answering emails with the same professionalism I had maintained for 5 years. On the surface, nothing about my behavior changed. Underneath, everything had. I spent that day refining the archive I had built, organizing screenshots chronologically, and drafting a clean summary of events that focused strictly on facts. I avoided emotional language. I avoided assumptions about intent. I listed timestamps, file paths, and subject lines. I knew that if I ever presented this, clarity would matter more than outrage. Around noon, I overheard 2 analysts discussing the upcoming strategic planning session on Tuesday. They were impressed with how quickly Lauren had stepped into the role. One of them mentioned how proactive she had been over the past few months in looping Mark into conversations early. That word again, proactive. I realized something important in that moment. She had not only forwarded my work upward, she had shaped the narrative around it before anyone else had a chance to question it. Later that afternoon, an email from Lauren landed in my inbox requesting updated performance metrics for the Harrison account by Monday at 10 a.m. She framed it as preparation for her presentation. I opened the message and reread it carefully. The language implied that she would be consolidating insights gathered from the team. I knew exactly what that meant. If I simply handed over another polished analysis, it would likely reappear on Tuesday under her authorship. I decided to adjust my approach. I responded professionally, confirming that I would prepare a data summary for internal discussion and that I would also attend Tuesday's session to provide context if needed. I copied Mark on the reply. It was a small shift, but deliberate. That evening, I did not stay late. Instead, I went home and reviewed my notes from a distance, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a glass of water. I mapped out the sequence one more time. January through June. Drafts sent. Edits made. Emails forwarded. Credit reassigned. I asked myself a simple question. If I raised this formally, what outcome did I actually want? Was it the title? An apology? Public acknowledgement? The answer surprised me. What I wanted was accuracy. I wanted the record to reflect reality. Monday arrived with a humid heat that pressed against the office windows. I delivered the Harrison metrics at 9:15 a.m., attaching a concise executive summary and explicitly stating in the email that the analysis was based on the forecasting model I had developed in February. Again, I copied Mark. Lauren replied 10 minutes later thanking me and confirming she would integrate the data into her presentation. I could almost predict how the next day would unfold. At 3:30 p.m., Mark sent a reminder about Tuesday's strategic planning meeting, emphasizing the importance of alignment and transparency as we moved into the next fiscal quarter. That word, transparency, lingered in my mind. I opened the presentation draft Lauren had shared with leadership in advance. Slide after slide mirrored the structure of the blueprint I had drafted weeks earlier. The milestones, the resource allocation, even the phrasing of key objectives followed my original outline. I compared them side by side, noting the similarities down to specific percentage targets and quarterly benchmarks. By the time the office lights dimmed that evening, I had reached a decision. If transparency was the theme of Tuesday's meeting, then transparency was exactly what I would bring. Not accusations, not confrontation, just documentation, organized and ready. The narrative had been building quietly for months. I intended to let the facts speak in a room where perception had once overshadowed them. Tuesday morning arrived heavy and overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes the city feel quieter than usual. I got to the office at 7:15 a.m., earlier than normal, carrying my laptop and a folder with printed timelines I had prepared the night before. I did not plan to create a scene. I planned to be precise. The strategic planning session was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the large conference room on the 12th floor, the one with the wall-mounted screen and seating for 20. By 9:50 a.m., most of the department had gathered, along with two senior directors from another division who dialed in remotely. Lauren stood near the front, reviewing her slides on the screen. I recognized the layout immediately. Clean white background, navy headers, the exact structure I had used in my original blueprint. When the meeting started, Mark introduced her as the driving force behind the new operational roadmap. He spoke confidently about her initiative and strategic clarity. I kept my expression neutral and listened. Lauren began presenting, walking through quarterly goals, revenue projections, and resource allocations. As she clicked through the slides, I noticed entire sections lifted almost word for word from the document I had drafted 3 weeks earlier. The 90-day stabilization plan, the 180-day expansion targets, the performance benchmarks tied to specific percentage increases. She delivered them smoothly, as if they had originated in her own late-night work sessions. About halfway through, she displayed the updated Harrison performance metrics I had sent the previous morning. The chart formatting was identical to mine. The executive summary language remained largely unchanged, except for a slight shift in tone that framed the analysis as part of her broader strategic oversight. When she paused for questions, one of the senior directors asked how the forecasting model had been constructed and whether it could be replicated across other accounts. Lauren responded that she had refined the methodology over the past few months to ensure scalability. That was the moment I realized the narrative had expanded beyond isolated documents. It had evolved into ownership of systems I had built from the ground up. My forecasting model had taken weeks of iteration, adjusting formulas down to decimal-level precision, stress testing projections under different revenue scenarios. Hearing it described as something she had refined felt less like a misunderstanding and more like a full transfer of authorship. I glanced at Mark. He nodded approvingly, clearly convinced. The room remained attentive, unaware of the backstory that had unfolded quietly over 6 months. As Lauren moved toward her final slides, outlining long-term growth initiatives, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. I was not nervous. I was focused. The documentation on my laptop was organized in a sequence that mirrored her presentation. Every milestone she referenced could be traced back to a draft I had saved, time-stamped, and emailed weeks earlier. When she concluded, Mark thanked her and opened the floor for additional input from the team. A few analysts offered supportive comments. Then there was a brief pause, the kind that invites someone to speak. I looked around the table at colleagues who had worked alongside me for years. They trusted the process because they assumed it was accurate. I understood then that silence would not simply preserve peace. It would confirm the revised history that had just been presented as fact. I slowly raised my hand, waiting for Mark to acknowledge me. My voice, when I began to speak, sounded steady, measured, and deliberate, exactly the way I had practiced it in my head the night before. Mark nodded in my direction, giving me the floor, and I stood slowly, keeping my laptop open in front of me. I began by saying that I appreciated the clarity of the roadmap and that I wanted to add context around the development of the forecasting model, an operational framework being discussed. My tone was calm, steady, almost analytical. I walked to the front of the room and connected my laptop to the screen, asking if I could briefly share a timeline that might help answer the earlier question about scalability. Mark agreed. The first slide I displayed was simple. It showed a screenshot of the original forecasting model file with the creation date in February and my name listed as the author. I explained that I had built the initial structure over several weeks, testing revenue scenarios across multiple client segments to ensure that the projections remained accurate within less than 1% variance. I clarified that the methodology was designed for team use, and that collaboration was always encouraged. I then advanced to the next slide, which displayed the email I had sent at 10:48 p.m. on a Tuesday night in February, attaching the draft and inviting feedback. The timestamp was clearly visible. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply described the sequence. The room grew quieter. I clicked forward again, showing the version history from the shared drive, highlighting the ownership change and subsequent edits that occurred 2 days before the leadership review. I stated that the refinements were primarily formatting adjustments and language shifts, while the underlying formulas and projections remained unchanged from the original draft. One of the senior directors leaned closer to the screen, studying the details. I continued, moving to the operational roadmap slide that had been presented earlier. Side by side on the screen, I displayed my initial blueprint from 3 weeks prior and the current presentation slide. I pointed out the identical milestone structure, including the 90-day stabilization target and the 180-day expansion plan. I mentioned that I had shared the blueprint internally for feedback and that it had later been incorporated into the department strategy. My voice did not rise. My posture did not change. I was not there to argue. I was there to clarify authorship. I concluded by saying that I believed in transparent collaboration and that I wanted to ensure the record accurately reflected the contributions of everyone involved. When I stepped back, the room remained silent for several seconds. I glanced briefly at Lauren. Her expression was composed but tighter than before, her hands clasped together on the conference table. Mark cleared his throat and asked a few procedural questions about file access and draft circulation. I answered each one directly, referencing the documented timestamps and shared folders. The senior director who had originally asked about scalability spoke up and said it was important to maintain clear attribution for intellectual contributions, especially when systems were being replicated across divisions. No one raised their voice. No one interrupted. The atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to evaluative. For the first time since that Monday morning announcement, the narrative in the room was no longer one-dimensional. It was layered with evidence. I returned to my seat, folding my hands on the table, feeling neither triumphant nor angry. I felt aligned with the truth of what had happened. The applause from a week earlier had been loud and immediate. This silence felt heavier, more deliberate. And in that silence, perception was no longer uncontested. The silence in the conference room did not break with applause or confrontation. It shifted into questions. One of the senior directors asked for access to the original files so he could review the version history himself. Mark agreed and requested that both Lauren and I forward the relevant documents after the meeting. Lauren finally spoke, her voice steady but noticeably more formal than before. She said that collaboration had always been part of the department culture and that ideas often evolved through shared input. She emphasized that her intention had never been to misrepresent anyone's contribution. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I clarified calmly that I valued collaboration as well and that my goal was simply to ensure accurate attribution, especially when performance and leadership evaluations were based on those contributions. I stated that if credit had been shared transparently from the beginning, this conversation would not have been necessary. The senior director nodded and reiterated that clarity in authorship was essential for strategic planning and talent development. Mark then suggested that the meeting conclude early so leadership could review the documentation in detail. As everyone gathered their laptops and notebooks, the mood was controlled but undeniably different from how it had begun. There were no side conversations congratulating anyone. There were no celebratory remarks about momentum. Instead, people left quietly, processing what they had just seen. Back at my desk, I forwarded the archived screenshots and timeline summary to Mark and the two senior directors, copying Lauren. I attached only materials that were already accessible within shared drives, nothing confidential beyond my role. My email was concise and factual. Within an hour, I received a calendar invitation from Human Resources for the following morning at 9 a.m. The subject line read, Documentation Review. Lauren was included in the invite. That afternoon, Lauren approached my desk. She asked if we could speak privately. I agreed, and we stepped into a small conference room near the break area. She closed the door and took a slow breath before speaking. She said she had never intended for the situation to escalate publicly. She said she believed she had contributed strategic framing to the projects and that leadership had responded to that framing. I told her I did not dispute that she had added value in presentations. What I disputed was the removal of authorship from foundational work. I explained that when files are forwarded without context and ownership fields are changed before reviews, it alters perception in measurable ways. I mentioned the promotion decision and how perception had been cited as the determining factor. She did not deny forwarding drafts. She said that in fast-moving environments, lines can blur. I responded that documentation exists precisely to prevent that blur. The conversation remained controlled, professional, almost clinical. There were no raised voices, only acknowledgement that what had happened could no longer be treated as informal. The next morning, Human Resources reviewed the file histories and email threads in detail. They asked clarifying questions about access permissions, draft timelines, and presentation sequences. I answered each question directly. Lauren did the same. By the end of the session, it was clear that multiple documents central to leadership evaluations had originated from my drafts without consistent attribution. Human Resources concluded that a formal review of the promotion decision would be initiated pending further evaluation by senior leadership. When I walked back to my desk, the office felt unusually quiet. People glanced up briefly as I passed, then returned to their screens. The narrative had shifted again, not through accusation, but through documentation. For the first time since that announcement day, the outcome was no longer fixed. It was under review. The formal review took 2 weeks, and during that time the office operated in a strange state of suspended normalcy. Lauren continued performing managerial duties, but major strategic decisions were temporarily routed through Mark and one of the senior directors. Human Resources conducted additional interviews with team members, focusing on workflow, authorship practices, and communication patterns. I was asked to provide a detailed account of how drafts were typically circulated and how ownership fields were managed within shared drives. I answered carefully, emphasizing process rather than personality. I did not speculate about motives. I did not assign labels. I simply described what I had documented. In the meantime, I continued doing my job. I led client calls, updated performance dashboards, and met deadlines. If anything, I became more disciplined about copying relevant stakeholders on deliverables and clearly labeling collaborative contributions. I understood that regardless of the outcome, my reputation would be shaped by how I handled this period. On a Thursday morning, Mark asked me to step into his office. His expression was serious but not hostile. He closed the door and explained that after reviewing documentation and interviewing leadership, the company had determined that attribution inconsistencies had materially influenced the promotion evaluation process. As a result, the promotion decision would be reassessed. He stated that Lauren would remain in her current role pending further evaluation, but that a corrective action plan was being implemented regarding documentation and credit transparency. He then paused and said that leadership acknowledged the foundational role I had played in developing the forecasting model and operational roadmap. The reassessment process would include a fresh evaluation of my candidacy based on documented contributions. I listened quietly. I had imagined this moment many times over the past 2 weeks, yet when it arrived, it felt less dramatic than expected. There was no surge of triumph. There was a sense of balance being restored. A week later, I was informed that the management position would transition to a co-leadership structure during a probationary period while governance practices were formalized. I was offered the title of operations lead with direct oversight of forecasting systems and client strategy development, along with a salary adjustment that reflected the scope of responsibility. Lauren would retain managerial responsibilities related to cross-departmental coordination, but future performance evaluations would require documented attribution for strategic initiatives. The announcement was made in a department meeting that felt noticeably more measured than the previous one. There was no applause this time, only acknowledgement and clarity. Afterward, several colleagues stopped by my desk to express quiet support. Lauren approached me later that afternoon. She said she respected how I had handled the situation and that the process had been a learning experience for her. I told her that professional growth often comes from uncomfortable clarity. Our working relationship shifted from informal collaboration to structured coordination, each of us more careful, more explicit about ownership. Over time, the tension eased into professionalism. Looking back, I realized the promotion had not simply been about a title. It had been about narrative control. For months, I had believed that hard work would automatically translate into recognition. What I learned instead was that in corporate environments, documentation shapes perception, and perception shapes opportunity. By choosing to present facts rather than frustration, I did not just protect my contribution. I re-established the record. And once the record was aligned with reality, everything else followed.